how does this approach in utilizing next generation sequencing add value? How do we deal with the additional costs? It's a question today that's front and center. And so I'll hit that question from a couple of different perspectives. One thing, I think there's a bit of clarification that I'd like to go through in terms of just the cost of doing this type of testing. We often hear that the cost of doing the human genome is now coming down to under $1,000. But I think it's really important to understand what that is and what it isn't. So as we think about Foundation One, which is Foundation Medicine's molecular profile, it's important to think about the cost and the requirements that go into this test from three different perspectives. There's an enormous amount of work that goes on before the sequencing, the sample preparation, and putting our laboratory in a position where we can extract nucleic acid, DNA, and RNA from a very small piece of paraffin-embedded tissue is extremely challenging to do. It is something that this company has perfected, but there's also a cost burden that is associated with that aspect of the testing. The second part is the cost associated with the sequencing. This is a component that is coming down, but we need to think about running sequencing on a germline sample, which is basically a blood sample, versus applying sequencing to human cancer tissue. That is an entirely different beast than running next generation sequencing, doing a whole genome at under $1,000. This is a much more costly enterprise than running it on germline tissue. And the final piece is, once we have all that data, what do we do with it? How do we take that information and translate it into something that's actionable? There's another piece there. So I want to make sure that we separate out this notion of $1,000 genome from all the costs that actually go into running this type of test for patients with a cancer. It's important not only for Foundation Medicine to understand it, not only for oncologists to understand it, but of course it's critically important for the payer community to understand it, because this is, again, it's a complex endeavor, it's a new endeavor, and it's something that we as a community have to continue to think through and work through. The reason that we have to push in this direction and figure this out together is that the current paradigm for molecular testing in the United States must change. Number one, we are running out of tissue to continue down the current path. If we think we're going to run 3, 5, 10 individual molecular tests and continue to do that on these very small patient biopsies, think again. We're running out of tissue and we won't get the answers that we ultimately need. The second challenge, and this comes back to the cost question, is think about the additional testing that's required every time a new molecular test is ordered. It's not $100, it's roughly $500 on average. And so if I'm a lung cancer specialist and I'm treating a patient with non-small cell lung cancer and I want to run 10 individual molecular tests, that's at least a $5,000 price tag, and the number of tests that are being ordered are only growing. So that's a key component. The third aspect of cost relates to the therapeutic decisions that are being made. And this starts to get a little complicated, but today, if a patient is relatively late stage in his or her disease, chances are they're getting a broad-based chemotherapeutic. Some of these chemotherapies have been around for a long time. The cost of the drug itself is not that significant, may not be that significant. The side effects, the ER visits, the impact on the patients, and even the cost to the healthcare system associated with those adverse impacts on the patient can become very significant. So if we utilize this technology to work with smaller sample sizes, number one, so we're not wasting tissue. If we utilize this technology to avoid the cost associated with the growing number of individual tests that are going to be ordered, and we utilize this technology to select the right therapeutic up front, it might change some of the fears that we have around this technology. And what I can tell you is that while we are in the early days of working with the payers, The payers have been receptive. Medicare has been receptive. They all understand that this is the next wave of molecular testing. They all understand the clinical value, which is really important, that we all know this is going to have an impact in the clinic, and they are there with us. And now we're simply starting the dialogue, and part of that dialogue has to be backed up with clinical data, pharmacoeconomic data, clinical data, to make sure that we all arrive at the end at the appropriate endpoint. The reason that I am optimistic is because it is the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do for the patient. It's the right thing to do for the oncologist. And in this case, we can say ultimately it's going to be the right thing to do for the payer as well.